My name is Joyce Cheeks. I'm an attorney in Columbia, South Carolina, and I'm married to Ken Cheeks. I was born in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Spartanburg is in the upstate of South Carolina, and Spartanburg is more, well, at least when I was growing up, it was more of a manufacturing kind of town. We had a lot of mills in that area. You know, they made clothing and fabric and that kind of thing, and that was really the hub of employment for the black people in Spartanburg. Most of the people, you know, a lot of people became middle class working for the mills and the manufacturing companies up in Spartanburg at that time. I would describe my family growing up as unconventional, I guess you would say. I was the second child of a single mother. And of course, this was during the late 50s, early 60s. So that kind of was a stigma at that time. Today being a single mother is almost popular sometimes, but at that time, it was really more of a, it was more something to hide. And so being the second child of a single mother, you know, was a unique experience. And then because I lived with my single mother and my sister, who was a year and 10 months older than myself, we lived with my grandfather and my step-grandmother. So I had a happy childhood, but it was an unconventional household. Well, like I said, my sister was a year and 10 months older than me, so we were obviously very close because we were so close in age, but still it was almost 2 years older than me, so it was like having a big sister. But she was very protective of me. I guess if you had to describe us, I was more of the athletic child and she was the more maternal child. So she always took care of me maternally. I mean, she would cook for me, and she would, we would go to school, and at school at that time, you could go from one class to the other, and she would always have the lunch money that my mother would give her, and she would always come to me and bring my lunch money to my room. And, you know, my mother used to always tell me that she would have conversations with her about me and what I was doing or what I should have been doing. So she was, even though it was 2 years older, she was like a mothering figure for me as well as my mother. And like I said, I was more the athletic person, so I took care of her in the sense that she was not a fighter. I was more of a fighter. And so, you know, I can remember one time there was a time when I think we were walking to school, and the school was like a block from our house. And it was called Dean Street School, and I later learned actually that it was one of the first black schools for all black children in Spartanburg. But anyway, we were going to the school, and she had been bullied by this little boy that was around, and she was scared to walk to school. And of course, me being who I was, I told her, you know, no, you don't need to be scared of that. I'll walk with you. And so, so I was the fighter, and I knew that they weren't going to mess with her if I was with her. And of course, it never happened. And so that's kind of the symbiotic relationship we had. She looked out for me in one way, and I looked out for her in another. Let me say this. When my sister turned 12, around the time she turned 12 years old, she got diagnosed with lupus. At the time, I didn't have any idea what lupus was, but I knew it was an illness, and I knew it was something. I knew it had some kind of something was bad about it, because my mother was always in turmoil about it. And so, but I didn't know. All I knew was I saw rashes on her all the time, and I'd see her legs swelling, and she wanted to buy boots so that she could cover up her legs from swelling and that kind of thing. So I knew it was something, and it was something that was changing, about her. My mother and I talked, and she told me what it was, and she told me it was incurable. But again, it just didn't resonate with me so much. But so we went through that. I can remember, going back and forth to the hospital in Spartanburg. And at that time, they had what they call the Negro ward of the Spartanburg General Hospital. So she was back and forth in the Negro ward of Spartanburg General Hospital so many times. And I can remember, the ward, they actually were wards that had people, lots of black people all over the wards. And, you could look down the hall and you'd see just tons of people in beds wide open. Now, I think they finally got her in a room. I think she was in a room with maybe 4 or 5 people in that room as well. But I can remember walking from school and going back and forth to the hospitals during that year. And so then in December, I turned 12 of that year. And then January of the next year, I remember that I was in bed one morning, and my grandmother came into the room. Actually, the night before, they had taken my sister to the hospital again. And, it had become so routine that I didn't even, it wasn't a big deal to me. So I woke up the next morning, and my grandmother came into the room, and she was crying. And I said to her, we called her Nanny at the time, called my grandfather Pop and my grandmother Nanny. And I can remember saying to her, don't cry, Nanny, she's gonna be all right, because every time she had gone to the hospital, she had been okay. So that was just my way of consoling my grandmother. And I remember her just standing there looking at me, and she said, Joyce, in her own way, being an elderly woman, she said, Joyce, you ain't got no sister no more. And it didn't really hit me what she was saying, but it all of a sudden it just came to it meant I understood what she was saying, and I realized that my sister had died from lupus, and I think that sort of changed my whole life trajectory. I think it did. It changed my life. Yeah. I felt, I don't know, I think I must have, I don't remember very much. I don't remember much about my sister, about our interactions. The things I told you, or the things that I've talked about, are basically the things that I remember about our childhood. Because I think in that moment, I just erased all of that because it was too much for me to deal with at that time. I just turned 12. She would have turned 14 the next month. So I just think I detached from it, I think. The home for me, it got very quiet. It got very empty. Because, as I said, we lived with my grandparents, so my mother, my sister, and I all lived in the same room. In fact, I lived in the same, I grew up and slept in the same bed that I was born in, because I was born in my house. So my sister and I and my mother all slept in the same bed together. So sleeping in the bed was even different. Going to school was different because nobody brought me my lunch money anymore. I was, I think, maybe in the 7th grade at that time, and just life was different. I walked to school by myself now. And my mother, now I realize the impact it must have had on her, because being a single mother and not having, any support herself. I think I tried to become that support for her. So I tried to become the perfect child, to do everything that my mother needed. So our whole household changed. I found myself, I didn't want to be by myself anytime, but I felt alone. Not lonely, but alone. So life changed completely at that time. Yeah, I was pretty well known. I was voted most athletic. I was Miss Carver High. That was the all-black school in Spartanburg, South Carolina. So I was pretty well known in the city, yeah. Well, my father actually lived in Spartanburg also, but never really dealt with me very much, never dealt with my sister and me very much. As I came to learn, he was actually married. So I began, and I never could actually acknowledge him as the person that was my father, and he never acknowledged me as his daughter. So I learned to feel ashamed of myself because I felt like my parents were ashamed of me. I now realize that they were just ashamed of what they did, but I took it as they were ashamed of me. And so I sort of became ashamed of myself. So I always kept that hidden, but I always felt like I saw this doll one time. This was later in life, and I saw this doll in a store, and this doll was called Junk Girl. And when I saw it, it just jumped at me because I realized that that's how I had always felt about myself, that I was a junk girl. Definitely. I mean, I was always a great student anyway. I mean, I took calculus in high school by myself. I was the only person in the school taking calculus because I took math all through school and advanced math and so forth. So one of my principals, who wasn't even a teacher, decided that he was going to take it upon himself to teach me calculus. And so he taught me calculus in this little room that they set aside in there. And so I always had this drive anyway, but I can remember when I went to New York after I graduated from high school, and I went to New York because my friend and I were going to, our guidance counselor told us that there were these jobs in New York where you could be a maid and you could get paid for doing that. And I wanted to go to college. I knew I didn't have money to go to college. So we took we got on the bus. I remember very vividly. The bus was crowded. We went to New York, and this agency assigned us these maid jobs. And so mine didn't work out because that just wasn't me. I just was not built to be a maid, and that was probably a good thing for me, that I recognized I was not built to be a maid. But my cousin came and picked me up and took me to a job that she was working on. And because I had taken this calculus class, they gave me this math test, and I, of course, aced this math test. And so I got this job as a figure clerk at Arlen's department store up there. But anyway, I'm saying all that to say that while I was in New York, this was one of the few times I called my father and asked him to help me to go to college, because I had gotten part of a scholarship, but I couldn't afford to go to the school because it was out of state. And I asked him to help me to go to school, and he told me that he couldn't afford to help me. And in that moment, I said to him, okay, you don't have to worry. I will never ask you for anything else again. And I didn't. And that's when I made up my mind that I was going to I would never have to depend on him or anybody for my well-being again. So that had a lot to do with it as well. I don't know. That's the truth. I mean, until I became an attorney, I really had never met an attorney in my life because I was never in an environment where there were attorneys. But when I went to college, I majored in math, and I was teaching after we moved to Fayetteville, North Carolina, after I married my husband. And I was praying all the time, God, just tell me what you want me to do, because I love teaching, but I know I just had this inner feeling that there was more than that I was supposed to be doing. And so one day I was in the house, in the apartment, I was ironing, and all of a sudden it came into my head, go to law school. And when it came to me, I just knew that was it. And I told my husband, I got it. It came to me today. And I said, I'm going to law school. And I immediately went out. I bought LSAT books, because back then, there weren't any computers, so you couldn't really go in and do your research on the computer. I went out and bought LSAT books. I started studying. I called the University of South Carolina to find out what I needed to do to get into law school. They sent me the package, and this probably was in maybe January of that year, and by August I was in law school. Wow. I'd been accepted. I didn't have money, but I'd been accepted into law school. Again, I didn't choose it, but I think that's why it chose me. I think that is just a perfect example of how all things work together for good for those who love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. I think that's what he called me for, to advocate for the marginalized and for, people who feel less than. Well, Ken is from Spartanburg also. Ken is a musician. Ken's a saxophone player. And so Ken and I met at my church, Majority Baptist Church, when we were probably 6, 7, 8 years old. So I've known him my entire life. He played saxophone. Ultimately, I played saxophone. Both of us played saxophone at South Carolina State. And as we were traveling back and forth with the band, well, at that time, South Carolina State was not allowing women on the band. So I was one of 5 females on the band at the time. So there weren't a lot of females to choose from when you're riding on this bus with a bunch of guys. So, Ken and I knew each other. And to be honest, Ken had been interested in me for quite some time. So as we, used to travel around with the band and seeing him every day with the band, we just sort of got together. And then I started seeing him as he was playing, and he kind of looked different, up on that stage. So we got together, and we've been together ever since. And we'll actually be celebrating our 50th wedding anniversary this year. Well, first of all, of course, I was determined as I was growing up that I would never have a child out of wedlock. My son's conception was actually a surprise to us, but we were married, of course. We had been married like 5 years before he was conceived. But he was everything that I wanted in a child. I'd actually seen this little baby on Ebony magazine at one time, and so when my son was born, he was that little baby, and he was just everything that I ever want. I wanted a boy for some reason. I don't know why, but I wanted a boy, and he was that. When he was born, I must have carried him probably over 9 months. So he was had to be delivered by cesarean, And I can remember being in the hospital, and I'd been cut, because at that time, again, they had to do the cutting kind of cesarean, not the little, easier way that they have now. So I was laying in the hospital bed and trying to get some rest in the middle of the night. Must have been 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. And I all of a sudden heard this screaming down the hall. And it was getting closer and closer and closer. And next thing I know, somebody's knocking on my door, and the nurse is saying, "Miss Cheeks, can you please take this baby in your room? Because he is waking up every baby in this hospital." And so I said, "Of course you can bring him in." And as soon as he got to my door, he stopped crying. And he did not cry anymore that night. And so I knew that he knew that we were meant to have a special bond together. And to this day, we have a very, very special bond. He was the kind of child that was never ashamed to hold my hand. Some kids, if you're with their parents, they don't, they don't want to be seen holding. It was the thing for him to grab my hand and to hug and love. So, I was blessed that I had a very loving son. And to this day, he still is. Probably so. I'm sure I was probably, I never wanted my son or my child to be in a single family situation. So I think it did, but I got a lot of my parenting skills from my mother, because I don't want to diminish the love and affection and caring that she had, because I know that in spite of my circumstances, she was an exceptional mother that worked extremely hard to give me everything that she could possibly give me. She bought my saxophone. To this day, I don't know how she was able to afford that saxophone that I got, but because I wanted it in the 7th grade, I remember her walking around the corner, because she had to walk back and forth to work. I remember her walking around the corner with that saxophone for me. So I never really knew I was poor, because she always worked to give me whatever I needed. So I tried to be that same kind of mother. Being a grandmother is so different than being a mother. I don't know. I can't even explain it. Like, we were on the phone for an hour on Zoom last night with my grandbaby, because they live in California now, and so we really only get to see them about once a year. But we were playing in her dollhouse, and it's so different to be a grandmother, that you can give love, you don't have to discipline. So being a grandmother is a blessing, just a blessing. Exactly. It's such a deep level, because it's like the love goes through your child into that, so it's 2 times. and my son always says, when I come to visit, he just has to get out of the way so I can spend time, so I can get to my grandchild. Well, I really think the most profound spiritual moment was actually the answer to my prayer about what to do with the rest of my life, because that was a long time coming, and I wasn't sure if the answer was going to come. So I really believe that was God speaking to me to shine a light on my purpose, and to reveal my purpose to me. So that was probably the most. I'll give you another example though. When my husband and I moved to Columbia for me to go to law school, he had just finished getting his master's degree at Norfolk State University in music. And actually we came down here with no job. We just moved to Columbia on faith. I had been accepted into law school, and we were going to stay with my sister-in-law who lived here. And my husband, having his brand new degree In fact, he hadn't even marched from that degree, and he went to Benedict to apply for a job in the music department. And to make a long story short, he got the job as the band director at Benedict College. And the gentleman over the department came to him and said, "I don't know how you got this job because there was no job for a band director." So it had to be God pulling it all together, to make it work. And again, that's why I go back to all things work together for good if it's done according to His purpose. Well, and you're right about my mother. My mother, obviously losing a child is probably one of the hardest things that any parent can go through. And so my mother actually had, after that time, she went through a real bad time, and what they call then, she had a nervous breakdown. So there was a period of time that I was totally alone for a while. So I think I learned to detach from those kinds of things and to always try to move forward. And sometimes I regret that, because when I leave a town, for example, we lived in Virginia when we moved to Columbia from Virginia, and we made a lot of really close friends because we had people who would help babysit for us and things like that, neighbor right beside us. And when I moved to Columbia, I just never connected back with that family. Not that I didn't love them, not that I didn't think about them, but I just was so tunnel visioned on my next purpose or my next step that I just never got back to those people who I left behind. And so sometimes I now think that, I have some regrets that I do detach like that. But at the same time, sometimes that detachment allows me to move forward to the next phase of my life. So, there's some good and bad in all of it. That detachment probably is a protective device for me to try to avoid feeling leaving or being left. I probably still have that in me, so to protect myself, I probably use it for that, yeah. If I could talk to the younger Joyce, I would tell her that it's going to be all right. I would tell her that that there is going to be pain in life, and you're going to have to learn to live with it, but everybody goes through pain. Everybody has a story, and you feel like you're junk girl, but God knows that you're not. I would like to be remembered as a person who has made a difference in other people's lives. That's very important to me. I would like to be remembered as a person who uplifts and encourages. That's probably one of my strongest attributes, is being positive and uplifting, and letting people know that despite your circumstances, that there can always be better, there can always be more. You're not a product of your circumstances. I just hope that my future is, I do estate planning, and I have seen so many people who get to their golden years, I'd say, and are so unhappy, and their families aren't there to take care of them, and they feel lost and abandoned and depressed. I hope that my future is not like that. I hope that in my golden years that I find happiness, and that I don't become a depressing burden on my children and their children. I want to end this life happy. If this was my last conversation, I would say, I asked my mother that one time, I'd say, trust God, because He knows His plans for you, even if you don't know. Be good, and be good to others. Be kind to yourself, and equally important, take care of yourself, because this life can be really challenging if you don't do the self-care as well. If I listen to what my heart is trying to tell me, what would I say? To say, if I listen to what my heart, I always listen to what my heart is trying to tell me. That's how I've gotten through life, is listening to what my heart is trying. If anything, I would say maybe for me, don't always listen so much to your heart. Sometimes listen to your head. When I first started practicing law, one of the people that work with me told me if I continue to practice like that, I'll never get rich. And he was right, because I have not gotten rich. But, maybe if I listened more to my head, maybe I would have been rich by now. But, that's just my nature. I'm a heartfelt person. So that's my go-to is when I say listen to my heart, that's the same as listening to God for me. And so I always listen to my heart. So that's what I would say. What I know for sure is that God's plan is greater than my own. And that if you listen for His plan, that it will lead you to your purpose, and finding your purpose is the whole reason for us being here in the first place.